cracking right now in Oaxaca is a very intense situation. It's going on between one of the teachers' unions and the federal forces, so like the Mexican government. And it's all a battle over education reform right now. So to get a little more specific, we have to dive into a few different elements of the three elements that are at play here. For starters, it got violent on Sundays when the violence started, and the government was like, no, we're not using any live rounds, we're not using live ammos or nothing like that. But in reality they were, and they got caught lying multiple times over that. Obviously there was video and there's photos of some of the dead teachers, and it's not just teachers either, it's teachers, parents, and students that are protesting, right? And then what the military has also been doing in that area is they've been looting stores at grocery stores at night, so that the teachers, students, and everywhere else, they're trying to starve them out. So not only are they trying to starve them out like that, but they are also not allowing them to come into hospitals. So the military is very strong in the hospitals. They're not allowing ambulances to go out, and they're not allowing anybody to be treated for wounds unless they're part of the military forces. So there's those elements at play. And then the reason why it's cracking down so hard in two particular towns in Oaxaca is because one of them is where they have one of the biggest oil refineries there. So there's a lot of interest on the government side to keep shit squashed in that whole area. So that's on that part of the federal forces. As far as the education reform, that's what we should dive into a little more too, because the education reform is something that's going to be familiar to anybody who's been paying attention to some of the education reform that's been happening here in the U.S., but that's more like a testing ground. So what they've been doing over there is the president, Enrique Peña Nieto, is basically looking to privatize the whole education system, like they've done already with Pemex, with the petroleum, with the crude oil, which was the number one main resource that Mexico had that was of value. And also they've been doing it with healthcare. So there's also been doctors that have been fighting, doctors union that have been fighting the privatization of the healthcare system as well, right? So this healthcare reform wasn't written by any educators. It was written by the 12 richest men in Mexico, who own Televisa, who own a bunch of companies, and it was written by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So that should tell you right off the bat what kind of shit they're planning, because they're not looking to do education reform for the benefit of the people. What they're trying to do is they're trying to create a manufacturing colony. So they're trying to create a whole education system based on like trade schools. So what they're doing is it's proposing massive cuts to science, to technologies. Public universities are getting massive cuts, which means all the tuitions are going to go up. And they're trying to do standardized testing, and they're trying to hold all the teachers accountable to the same. And now that's where a lot of people will come in. They'll be like, oh, well, standardized testing. Well, yeah, all teachers should be held to a certain standard in education, right? And normally that's fine, but and that's where we dive into the second part of the teachers union. So this teachers union is very fucking unique. They're not, they were part of the regular nationwide teachers union, which was one of the biggest ones. It is the biggest one in all South America. But they broke off like 30, 40 years ago because they have a very, very different type of goal. So this teachers union that's been battling it's part of what's called the normalistas. They're part of what the normal translates into normal, but they're really what they are is they're rural schools and rural teachers. So
the same ones that disappeared in Ayotzinapa.
Ayotzinapa. It's the ssame ones that Ayotzinapa was students that were going to that school to become teachers to then go, because that's how the system works. The system works is if you live in a small farm town, and if there's any farming left, these small rural towns where you're miles away from the nearest school, miles away from running water and electricity sometimes.
Indigenous communities.
Yeah, indigenous communities. You go to a small school where you and a bunch of other kids are getting together to learn and to become educated, but more importantly so that you could become teachers. So that you could become teachers to go to other rural towns and serve out a year or two there, or 3 or however many it is, and go out to all these other small rural towns. So that's why this teachers union had to break off from the normal teachers union, because they're dealing with a whole set of other problems that the normal teachers unions don't have to deal with in the big cities, whether it be Mexico City, Guadalajara, or anything else.
And what are conditions like?
Exactly. So that's what we get to. So a lot of the times when we talk about these teachers and the schools, quote unquote, and I say schools, quote unquote, because it's very, very, very minimal. Most of them don't have running water, electricity. There's no money for supplies, notepads, and they're not teaching in the sense of, okay, well, there's 25 teachers and we're all teaching different grades. No, we're talking about dozens of students, but they're all being taught by one or two teachers at the most. And what it is they're being taught everything from kindergarten all the way up. So they're taking care of what an entire, it's not one curriculum, it's not one school program, it's an entirety of it.
And a lot of them don't even know Spanish.
Yeah, and that's the big hurdle that they deal with, is that you're dealing with indigenous populations that speak different languages, whether it be Tolteca, whether it be Tolteca, whether it be Nahuatl, so many there's different languages that they have to deal with. So they're doubling as language teachers, and then they're also doing all the work of everything else with no supplies, no electricity, no running water, and they get a small salary from the government. But most of the stuff really of what there is they work within the community, and they get fed by the community, and they do work within the community to do these things. So those are the type of teachers that we're dealing with. Because of that, you get a lot of socialist and communist teachers. So there are a lot of teachers that have been in the fight and have been in the struggle for a long time of indigenous resistance. So that's where the Ayotzinapa teachers come from. That's where a lot of the resistance and a lot of the fighting back that you see within states like Oaxaca, Guerrero, and all these, they come from these pockets of these schools that are used to creating teachers to go out into these rural communities. It's a whole different system from a normal education system.
And why are standardized testings an issue?
Well, yeah, there you go. And then standardized testing becomes a huge issue, as you could see with that, because they deal with other hosts of problems. You're not dealing with the same, okay, well, we need everybody's grade to be this at this age. It's like, they don't have the resources. I'd be fine with standardized testing if they had standardized resources. If Oaxaca got the same standardized resources that Guadalajara gets in a major city, okay, then cool, let's do standardized testing across the board. But that's not the case, and that's not what we're dealing with here. So because of that, they've been the biggest proponents and the biggest ones fighting against this education reform, because they're also going to be the ones that are affected the most by it. Their pensions are getting cut. They're going to get fired right away if
no
the standardized
benefits.
tests, no benefits, those are getting cut. So if the test scores aren't at a certain level, everybody gets fired, which means thousands of teachers laid off.
Mass
and they don't give a
layoffs,
fuck about what the excuse is. They're just going to be like, you didn't reach our standards, you're outsies. That's how that shit works. And that's why there's a lot of beef with standardized testing here in the US for the same exact reasons.
Yeah.
So you have that. You have no reasons with that. And still, so these teachers have been getting beaten, jailed, murdered, and they're still fighting. And they're fighting by setting up roadblocks with stones and rocks. They're fighting with Molotov cocktails made out of Coke glass bottles, gasoline, and tampons, versus a US-backed and US-trained and US-funded military force that comes out with M16s, body armors. They have helicopters, planes, drones, and all under the excuse of the drug war. Also, Mexico doesn't get an honest perspective on any of this, because one of the main backers of the education reform was the owner of Televisa, which is the biggest network in Mexico, the biggest TV and media network in Mexico. So one of the owners was the main backers of all this, because he benefits the most when you turn an entire nation into a manufacturing colony for the US and other European enterprises, right? So really what this comes down to is it's the same battle and the same struggle that we fight with here against neoliberalism and calling it and imperialism, neoliberalism and its policies. So that's why you have a lot of these tear gas cans that they're getting hit with are the same tear gas cans that are showing up in Palestine, the same tear gas cans that are showing up in Egypt, the same tear gas cans that they use in Ferguson, Missouri. They're all made here in the US, and that's how we're directly responsible for it, not only by funding and supplying them with weapons and training, but also by funding and supplying everything necessary in order to turn this into a manufacturing colony, right? And that's where that unity has to come into play, because Mexico for decades has been used not only as a testing ground, but kind of the fucking trash backyard, the dirty alley behind the U.S. We go there and take whatever the fuck we want, and we implement all the little tactics that we want to do. That's why the U.S.-Mexico border is one of the most militarized borders in the entire world. It's not because they're really trying to keep Mexicans out. What they're trying to do is they're trying to test all their cool-ass weaponry and infrared cameras and drone stuff. It's the same thing they do in Israel. That's why there's so much back and forth work between U.S. and Israel border patrol agents, because they're doing the same job out there with colonization. But yeah, that's it. That's the short of what's going on. And it's not just Oaxaca. There's also fights going on in Guerrero. There's battles going on in Chiapas. There's battles going on in Mexico City. It's across the nation. Yeah, and all this training and military funding is under the excuse of the drug war, but they never fucking attack any of the drug cartels with the same shit that they're coming and teaching us with. Never. Why? Because it's been proven time and time again that the cartels are in the same cahoots with the politicians, with the U.S. enterprises. It's all the same cabal of the same thing. That's why Citibank is laundering money for the cartels. Bank of America launders money for the cartels. President and politicians all fucking interact and intersect with all the cartel money, FBI agents, CIA, all that coke, CIA flying through on coke planes. People thought it stopped with Reagan and the Iran-Contra scandal, but there's still CIA planes coming over with coke. It's this whole methamphetamines manufacturing bases out there. It's all back and forth. It comes back to how can we get what can we sap from Mexicans to create shit that we need or want here in the U.S. without having to give them anything.
Other than cheap labor.
Yeah, then it's cheap labor. And so the audacity of people to get fucking mad at immigration is absurd. I mean, people could get mad at immigration, but that's not what it is. Yeah, but then in conclusion, that's what's going on in Oaxaca.
All right.